1.5 miles. That is the distance between the last chance a truck driver had to save his own life and the guardrail that failed to stop him. On the morning of November 3rd, 2025, a 23-year-old man from New York drove a loaded freightliner past a runaway truck ramp on the west side of a Colorado mountain pass. Smoke was already rising from his brakes. 90 seconds later, his truck hit a concrete barrier, bounced across the opposite lane, tore through a guardrail, and fell down a mountainside. He did not survive. The road that killed him has a name that sounds almost gentle. It is called Wolf Creek Pass, and for 109 years, it has been quietly deciding who gets through the San Juan Mountains and who does not. If you are watching this from Colorado, you already know the name. Maybe you have driven it. Maybe you have watched a truck's brake lights flare red on the switchback below you and felt your stomach drop before you even knew why. If you are watching from somewhere else, stay with this one, because the story of this road says something larger about every mountain highway in America that trucking companies still send their drivers over. Before we go further, if channels like this one are useful to you, subscribing costs nothing and helps more of these stories reach people who need them. Now back to the mountain. Wolf Creek Pass carries U.S. Highway 180 across the Continental Divide in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, connecting the towns of South Fork and Pagosa Springs. The summit sits at 10,857 feet above sea level. To put that in perspective, that is nearly 2 miles higher than Denver, a city already famous for its altitude. At the top, the air holds roughly a third less oxygen than at sea level. Snow can fall there in any month of the year. The pass carries a subarctic climate classification, the kind normally associated with far northern latitudes, not with a highway 200 miles from the New Mexico border. The nearby Wolf Creek ski area receives an average of 430 inches of snow every winter, more than any other ski resort in Colorado. That snowpack does not stay on the mountain. It becomes the ice sheet that waits under a thin layer of fresh powder on the road below, invisible until a tire finds it. The road exists because the alternative, more than a century ago, stopped existing. Before Wolf Creek Pass, travelers crossing this stretch of the San Juans relied on the Elwood Pass Road. In 1911, a flood destroyed it. State highway engineers J.E. Maloney and Ed Riley were given the job of finding a new route across the divide, and construction began that same year. It was slow, brutal work at altitude, using hand tools and horse-drawn equipment to carve a road out of solid granite and loose scree. The project was nearly finished by the fall of 1915, with about 10 days of work remaining, when an early winter storm shut the crews down for the season. The road finally opened on August 21, 1916, 12 feet wide, unpaved, and terrifying even at the low speeds of a Model T. It was doubled in width in 1930 as automobile traffic increased. It was not fully paved until 1950. A 900-foot tunnel on the eastern approach, designed to protect the highway from avalanche debris, did not open until November of 2005. In other words, this road has been modernized in pieces, decade by decade, for over 100 years, and it is still not tame. Local newspapers understood this a century ago and understand it now. In 2019, on the pass's own 103rd anniversary, the Durango Herald called it simply, in print, the state's #1 dangerous pass. That is not a YouTube exaggeration. That is a regional newspaper's considered editorial judgment, printed decades into the road's history, after decades of watching what happens on it. The mountain gave the road one more feature almost as an afterthought. Roughly 13 miles east of Pagosa Springs, the highway passes within sight of Treasure Falls, a waterfall that drops 105 feet into a rocky ravine just off the shoulder of the road. Drivers slow down for the view. Then the highway climbs back into the trees and begins the real business of the pass. Near the summit sits Wolf Creek Ski Area, founded in 1938 by a group of skiers from the San Luis Valley, including a local farmer named Kelly Boyce, who installed the resort's first rope tow by hand. The resort exists precisely because of the snowfall the mountain traps against the divide, the same snowfall that turns this highway into a sheet of packed ice for months at a time. In winter, Colorado's chain laws apply here as strictly as anywhere in the state, and a wide shoulder area near the summit doubles as an official chain-up station, because CDOT has learned, over 100 years of operating this road, that a truck without properly chained tires has no business starting the 8-mile descent at all. Here is the mechanism that makes the western descent so dangerous, and it has nothing to do with bad luck. From the summit down to the base near Treasure Falls, the highway drops through just over 8 miles at a sustained 7% grade. 7% does not sound dramatic until you put a fully loaded semi-truck on it. A big rig hauling 40,000 pounds of cargo builds momentum on a downhill grade that steep, and the only thing standing between that momentum and disaster is the truck's braking system. Professional drivers are trained to descend in a low gear, using the engine itself to control speed and to save the wheel brakes for fine adjustments only. Any driver who rides the brakes continuously rather than downshifting generates friction heat that the brake drums cannot dissipate fast enough. The technical term is brake fade. In practical terms, it means the brakes get hot enough that they simply stop working, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once. A driver who feels the pedal start to sink further and further toward the floor, with less and less resistance each time, is watching the exact moment their margin for error disappears, usually with several miles of downhill grade still ahead of them and nowhere flat to coast to a stop. 6.5 miles down from the summit sits a hairpin curve near a public scenic overlook, tight enough that a truck already struggling with speed has almost no margin left to correct. This is where the overwhelming majority of truck crashes on this pass have happened. CDOT maintenance officials have described the geometry here as deceptive in a specific way. Much of the highway on this stretch is 3 or 4 lanes wide, with generous paved shoulders, which can give an unfamiliar driver a false sense of security about how much room there is to recover from a mistake. The road looks forgiving. The grade underneath it is not. Officials have said publicly that many drivers find themselves already out of control by the time they are halfway down the pass, discovering the mismatch between how the road looks and how it behaves only after there is no longer time to fix it. The Colorado Department of Transportation has known about this pattern for a long time, and the numbers have been remarkably consistent year after year, no matter which 5-year window officials examine. In 2017, CDOT reported that between 2011 and 2015, there were 49 semi-truck crashes on the west side of the pass. In 2020, examining 2015 through 2019, the count was 47 crashes, 3 of them fatal. In an official travel advisory issued in August of 2023, the Colorado State Patrol reported that from 2015 through 2021, there were 54 semi-truck crashes on the west side of Wolf Creek Pass alone, again with 3 fatalities. 3 separate advisories, 3 overlapping time frames, and the same conclusion every time. This 8-mile stretch of road generates close to 10 commercial truck crashes a year, on average, in a state with dozens of other mountain passes competing for that same grim statistic. The posted speed limit heading down that side of the mountain is 25 miles per hour for any truck over 26,000 pounds. a number chosen specifically because higher speeds do not leave enough margin for the grade and the curve. To help drivers who lose that margin anyway, engineers built two runaway truck ramps into the mountainside on the west descent, gravel and sand inclines designed to catch an out-of-control vehicle and bring it to a stop without a cliff, a guardrail, or another vehicle in the way. One sits at mile point 162.5, roughly 4.5 miles below the summit. The second sits at mile point 161, about 6 miles down. State troopers have said publicly again and again that a driver who feels brakes failing should never hesitate to use them, because by the time a truck reaches the hairpin curve near the overlook, there may be no second option left. Wolf Creek Pass has a strange kind of celebrity for a rural mountain highway. In 1975, country singer C.W. McCall released a spoken-word song simply called Wolf Creek Pass, describing a fictional truck driver hauling live chickens who loses control on the descent, careens through the switchbacks, and ends up crashing through a feed store window in Pagosa Springs. It became a hit, half comedy, half cautionary tale, and it turned the pass into something close to folklore for an entire generation of American truckers, decades before any of them ever drove it themselves. The song is funny. The real crash reports are not. On September 21st, 2021, a 54-year-old truck driver named Rafat Podzik was heading west on Highway 160 in a 2010 Peterbilt, pulling a loaded trailer down through Mineral County. According to the Colorado State Patrol's preliminary investigation, Podzik's rig was traveling at a high rate of speed down the steep grade when it approached the sharp left curve that has claimed so many trucks before it. He steered right, away from the curve, and struck a concrete barrier. The truck went down the embankment, broke apart against a stand of trees, and Podzik was ejected from the cab. Investigators believed a combination of excessive speed and possible brake fade or outright brake failure caused the crash. There was no indication of drugs or alcohol. Another trucker driving behind him had a dash cam running and captured the entire sequence. That footage did not disappear into a case file. It circulated afterward through trucking safety channels, shared driver to driver, as a plain, unscripted example of exactly what this mountain does to a rig that arrives at the hairpin with too much speed and not enough braking left in reserve. Podzik did not survive. 4 years later, the mountain repeated itself with almost identical details. At 8:21 in the morning on November 3, 2025, Colorado State Patrol troopers responded to a single vehicle crash near mile marker 161, about 17 miles north of Pagosa Springs, just before the scenic overlook on the west side of the pass. A 23-year-old man from New York was driving a 2020 Freightliner south on Highway 160, hauling a trailer loaded with canned beverages. Witnesses told investigators the truck was moving at excessive speed, with black smoke visibly pouring from its brakes, the unmistakable sign of a braking system that had already failed or was about to. The truck struck the barrier wall on the right side of the road, bounced off, crossed into the opposing lane, and went through the guardrail on the left. It fell down a steep embankment, and both the cab and the trailer were destroyed in the descent. First responders could not immediately locate the driver in the wreckage because of the scale of the debris field. He was found later and pronounced dead at the scene, having been ejected from the cab during the crash. Investigators from the Colorado State Patrol later confirmed a detail that made the crash even harder to sit with. The driver had passed one of the two runaway truck ramps just 1.5 miles before losing control completely. The wreckage itself proved almost as stubborn as the mountain. It was not until the following spring, in April of 2026, nearly 6 months after the crash, that a recovery crew with a heavy-duty tow truck finally returned to pull the tractor and trailer off the hillside. The operation took 8.5 hours from start to finish, and both directions of Highway 160 had to be shut down in 30-minute to hour-long intervals throughout the day so the work could be done safely. Even then, a Colorado Department of Transportation spokesperson told reporters afterward that the operation had proven more complex than anticipated, and that cargo and other debris from the load of canned beverages still remained scattered on the hillside, with no firm date yet set for the final cleanup. Half a year later, the mountain had still not entirely let go of what it took. These two crashes, 4 years apart, share almost every element: a loaded truck, a downhill run on the west side, speed the driver could not shed in time, brakes that gave out before the hairpin curve, a runaway ramp that existed and was not used in time. This is not a road that occasionally punishes a reckless driver. This is a road with a documented repeating failure pattern that the state's own transportation department has been publicly warning drivers about since at least 2017, when CDOT launched a campaign with the blunt name "Beware the Wolf," specifically targeted at commercial truck drivers. If you have made it this far, you understand why professional drivers plan entire routes to keep this pass off their itinerary whenever they possibly can. We will come back to what happens when they can't. If you're finding this kind of deep dive into America's most dangerous roads useful, subscribing helps the channel keep making them. Now, let's talk about why avoiding Wolf Creek Pass is so much harder than it sounds. Here is the geographic trap at the center of this entire story. According to state highway records, Wolf Creek Pass is, in practical terms, the easiest and most direct overland route connecting southwestern Colorado to the rest of the state. Every other option requires a significant detour. A driver hoping to bypass Wolf Creek Pass has essentially 3 choices, and none of them are short. The first is to loop south through New Mexico, adding substantial mileage and border state fuel stops to a trip that would otherwise take a couple of hours. The second is Lizard Head Pass near Telluride, a high alpine route with its own steep grades and winter closures. The third is U.S. Highway 550 over Red Mountain Pass, better known by its nickname, the $1 Million Highway, a narrow 2-lane road cut into sheer cliffs above Ouray and Silverton, with long stretches that have no guardrail at all above drops of hundreds of feet. For a truck driver, choosing between Wolf Creek Pass and the $1 Million Highway is not really a choice between danger and safety. It is a choice between 2 different kinds of danger, and drivers who know the region well are keenly aware of it. The lack of a real alternative becomes obvious every time the pass closes. Colorado's Transportation Department closes Wolf Creek Pass regularly and deliberately for avalanche mitigation, winter maintenance, and safety operations, sometimes for as little as 2 hours at a stretch, with closure points set up 13 miles east of Pagosa Springs and roughly 19 miles west of South Fork, so crews can work safely on the mountain in between. Those short planned closures happen often enough that CDOT posts them as routine news releases, several times a season, year after year. But it is the unplanned closures that reveal what this corridor actually costs a driver who cannot use it. When the pass has to shut down entirely because of a major storm, a rock slide, or a serious crash, CDOT's own advisories tell drivers plainly that there is no short detour equivalent. The recommended alternate routes are themselves subject to closure during the exact same weather systems that shut down Wolf Creek Pass in the first place, meaning a driver can find both the mountain and its backup routes impassable on the same afternoon. For a commercial truck on a delivery schedule, a full closure does not mean a short delay measured in minutes. It can mean hours added to a trip, rerouted across unfamiliar mountain roads, through towns with few or no truck stops, in the same winter conditions that caused the original closure in the first place. This is precisely why experienced dispatchers and long-haul drivers who know this corridor will sometimes plan a longer route from the outset, one that avoids Wolf Creek Pass entirely, rather than gamble on conditions that could leave them stranded on a mountain with a documented, decade-spanning history of taking trucks off the road. What makes this particularly unforgiving is that the danger is not seasonal. Colorado State Patrol officials have said publicly in more than one advisory that the pass is dangerous, regardless of weather conditions, and that in the warmer months when there is no ice or snow to blame, the crashes still happen, caused almost entirely by loss of control and brake failure on the downgrade rather than by road surface conditions. That single fact reframes the entire danger of this mountain. It is not a winter problem that disappears with the snow. It is a physics problem built into the grade of the road itself that exists every single day of the year. A trucking company scheduling a summer delivery through southwestern Colorado faces the same 7% downhill grade, the same hairpin curve, and the same brake fade risk that killed Rifat Podzik in September, and the same risk that killed a 23-year-old man in November 4 years later, on a road with dry pavement and clear skies both times. CDOT has not ignored the problem. In 2018, the department completed a round of safety upgrades on the west descent, including new concrete safety barriers near the overlook, improved lane striping, and additional warning signage. Since then, the state has periodically staged safety checkpoints at the summit, where troopers stop commercial vehicles, brief drivers on the exact locations of the hairpin curve and the runaway ramps, and remind them to downshift early rather than relying on wheel brakes for the entire descent. In October of 2020, for example, CDOT and the Colorado State Patrol jointly ran a month of these safety stops, pulling over semi-trucks at the summit specifically to walk drivers through the pass before they started down it. These checkpoints are not symbolic. They exist because state officials know that a driver arriving at that curve for the first time, without local knowledge of exactly how steep the mountain gets or exactly where the last runaway ramp sits, is at dramatically higher risk than a driver who has made the run before. Every fatal crash reviewed here involved a driver descending that same stretch, and in the 2025 case, investigators specifically noted that the driver passed a runaway ramp he could have used, and did not. 2 years earlier, on a different stretch of the same descent, Rifat Podzik never got the chance to reach either ramp at all, because his rig went off the road before he could. Even the road's infrastructure keeps needing attention, more than a century after it was built. In the spring of 2026, CDOT began a months-long maintenance project on the pass's 900-foot tunnel, the same tunnel completed back in 2005 to shield the highway from avalanche debris on the eastern approach. Crews worked from 7 in the morning until 5 in the evening, 5 days a week, from mid-May through early October, rerouting traffic onto a paved bypass lane around the tunnel for the entire project. It is a small detail in the life of a highway, but it says something larger about this mountain. Even the newest piece of engineering on Wolf Creek Pass, a tunnel barely 20 years old, already requires ongoing structural upkeep just to keep functioning safely on a road where the oldest sections have now been carrying traffic for well over 100 years. The pattern that emerges from a century of history on this mountain is not really about bad drivers. It is about a road built in 1916 for horse-drawn traffic and Model T cars, widened in the 1930s, paved at mid-century, and never fundamentally regraded, now carrying 80,000-pound tractor trailers down the same 7% slope its original engineers cut into granite by hand. Modern trucks are faster, heavier, and more powerful than anything Maloney and Riley could have imagined when they surveyed this route more than 100 years ago. The mountain itself has not changed to accommodate them. Today, Wolf Creek Pass remains open year-round, still carrying commercial traffic across the Continental Divide, still closing without warning for storms, still funneling every truck that cannot justify the long way around through New Mexico or over the $1 Million Highway, back onto that same 7% grade, past that same hairpin curve, toward those same 2 runaway ramps that a driver has only seconds to decide whether to use. 1.5 miles. That is how much room a driver had on a clear November morning between his last chance and the guardrail. It is not a large number, and on a mountain that drops 8 miles at 7% grade, it goes by in under 2 minutes. A century ago, engineers with hand tools and horse-drawn equipment cut this road into granite because a flood had taken away the only other way through. They could not have known what an 80,000-pound truck would someday do to the grade they chose. Every trucker who has ever driven Wolf Creek Pass and every trucker who has deliberately chosen the longer road through New Mexico or over the $1 Million Highway instead is making a calculation about that same narrow window, whether they realize it or not. The mountain does not care which choice a driver makes. It only cares whether the brakes hold. If you have ever driven this pass yourself, loaded, empty, in a car, or behind the wheel of something much bigger, we would genuinely like to hear what it was like down in the comments. The mountain is still there, still open, still funneling trucks down that same 8 miles of granite it has carried them across for over 100 years, and it is not finished asking that question.